On the morning of December 7, 1941, as Japanese bombers descended upon Pearl Harbor, one man sat in silence aboard the flagship Nagato, anchored thousands of miles away in Hiroshima Bay. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack that would drag America into World War II, had just received confirmation. The strike was underway. But instead of celebration, witnesses reported something unexpected. He looked troubled. Because Yamamoto knew something his government refused to accept, something he had warned them about for years. This war, the one he had just started, was already lost. Japan's own admirals had calculated the odds, they had run the numbers, they had studied their enemy. And they had concluded in memo after classified memo that victory was mathematically impossible. So why did they attack anyway? This is the story of a nation that chose self-destruction over surrender, guided by men who knew exactly where it would lead. To understand Japan's fatal decision in 1941, we must first understand the trap they had built for themselves over the previous decade. By the late 1930s, Imperial Japan was an empire in crisis, not from external threats, but from its own ambitions. The nation had modernized at breathtaking speed. In less than 70 years, Japan had transformed from a feudal society into an industrial power with carriers, battleships, and one of the world's most formidable naval air forces. But this transformation came with a devastating vulnerability. Japan had almost no natural resources of its own. The empire imported 80% of its oil, most of it from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. It relied on foreign steel, rubber, and rare metals for its military machine. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience. For a nation committed to military expansion, it was an existential threat. Japan's war in China, which had begun in 1937, was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. The Imperial Army was bogged down in a brutal occupation that stretched across thousands of miles, bleeding men and materials with no end in sight. And then, in July 1941, everything changed. President Franklin Roosevelt, responding to Japan's continued aggression in Asia and its alliance with Nazi Germany, imposed a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed. Overnight, Japan lost access to 90% of its petroleum imports. The empire's strategic oil reserves, carefully stockpiled for precisely this scenario, would last 18 months, maybe 2 years if rationed severely. The clock was ticking. Japan's leadership faced an impossible choice: withdraw from China, abandon their imperial ambitions, and accept what they viewed as national humiliation, or seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia by force, knowing it would mean war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands simultaneously. The Japanese military establishment, dominated by army generals who believed in the samurai code of Bushido and the inevitability of armed conflict, pushed for war. But the men who would actually have to fight it, the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy, held a very different view.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 57 years old in 1941, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and one of the few senior Japanese officers who had lived extensively in the United States. He had studied at Harvard, he had served as a naval attaché in Washington, he had traveled across America, observing its industrial capacity firsthand, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the oil fields of Texas, the automobile factories of Detroit, and what he saw terrified him. In meetings with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and senior military officials throughout 1940 and 1941, Yamamoto was blunt. According to declassified records and post-war testimonies, he repeatedly stated that Japan could not win a protracted war with America. In one exchange, famously recorded by his staff, he told Konoe, "If ordered to fight, I can raise havoc with them for 1 year or at most 18 months. After that, I can give no one any guarantees." This wasn't pessimism, it was mathematics. Yamamoto had calculated the industrial output ratios. American production capacity in steel, oil, aircraft, and ships outstripped Japan's by factors of 10 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. But Yamamoto wasn't alone in his assessment. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff and technically Yamamoto's superior, held similar views. In August 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, Nagano presented a strategic assessment to Emperor Hirohito himself. The document was classified as most secret and remained hidden until American occupation forces discovered it in 1945. Nagano's conclusion was stark: the chances of victory in a war with the United States are not present. He outlined scenario after scenario, projecting naval losses, resource depletion rates, and American response capabilities. Every model ended the same way, with Japanese defeat. These weren't junior officers or academic theorists. These were the men at the very top of Japan's naval command structure. They had access to the empire's most sensitive intelligence. They understood ship production schedules, fuel consumption rates, and the brutal arithmetic of attrition warfare. And they all reached the same conclusion: war with America was suicide. So if Japan's own admirals knew the war was unwinnable, why did they proceed? The answer lies in a toxic combination of institutional pressure, cultural honor codes, and the dangerous logic of short-term tactical thinking overriding long-term strategic reality. First, understand the power dynamics within Japan's military government. By 1941, the Imperial Army and Navy operated almost as separate governments, each with their own strategic objectives and intelligence networks. The Army, bloodied but undefeated in China and obsessed with confronting the Soviet Union in the north, had become the dominant political force. Army officers had assassinated moderate politicians, intimidated civilian leaders, and created an atmosphere where opposing war was seen as treasonous. Admiral Yonai's removal from office in 1940 sent a clear message: admirals who opposed expansion would be sidelined or worse. The Navy faced an impossible position. If they refused to support the war, they would be blamed for national humiliation when Japan capitulated to American economic pressure. They would lose face, lose budgets, and lose relevance in a military establishment dominated by the Army. But if they supported the war, they could at least maintain institutional influence and control the timing and nature of the conflict. Yamamoto made a calculated decision. If war was inevitable, and by late 1941 he believed it was, then Japan's only chance was a devastating first strike. The plan for Pearl Harbor wasn't designed to win the war, it was designed to buy time. Yamamoto believed that if Japan could cripple the American Pacific Fleet in a single blow, it would take the United States 12 to 18 months to rebuild and counterattack. During that window, Japan could seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the strategic islands of the Pacific, creating a defensive perimeter so costly to breach that America might negotiate a settlement rather than pay the blood price of reconquest. It was a desperate gamble based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology. Yamamoto himself had warned that attacking the U.S. mainland, and Pearl Harbor, as an American territory, would be perceived that way, would awaken a sleeping giant. But the Japanese Army leadership dismissed this concern. They believed Americans were soft, decadent, unwilling to accept casualties for abstract strategic goals in Asia. They believed American racial diversity would prevent national unity. They believed the United States, facing war in Europe against Germany, couldn't afford a two-ocean conflict. They were catastrophically wrong about all of it.
There was also a deeper cultural factor at play, the concept of gekokujo, or insubordination from below. Throughout the 1930s, junior officers had repeatedly acted without authorization, provoking incidents that senior commanders then had to defend. The Manchurian Incident of 1931, which began Japan's conquest of China, was initiated by field officers without Tokyo's approval. By 1941, the precedent was set. Aggressive action would be supported after the fact. Senior admirals like Yamamoto may have opposed war in principle, but they would not defy the emperor once the decision was made. The military culture demanded absolute obedience to superiors and to the throne. Finally, there was the oil crisis timeline. Every day of delay meant more oil burned, more reserves depleted. By November 1941, Japan's Navy calculated it had enough fuel for one major offensive operation. After that, the fleet would be grounded.
The choice was binary: attack now while you still have fuel, or wait and lose the capacity to fight at all. The ticking clock eliminated the possibility of prolonged diplomatic solutions. On November 26, 1941, Secretary of State Cordell Hull delivered the U.S. government's final negotiating position: Japan must withdraw completely from China and Indochina. For the Japanese government, this was unacceptable, a humiliation that would topple the regime and dishonor the nation. The decision for war was formalized. Admiral Yamamoto's carrier strike force was already at sea, steaming toward Hawaii under radio silence. December 7, 1941. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. In 90 minutes, the attack sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,000 Americans. Tactically, it was a stunning success. Strategically, it was a catastrophic error, and Yamamoto's staff knew it within hours. The strike force, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had accomplished its primary objectives. The battleship Roe was devastated. But Nagumo made decisions that would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. He canceled the planned third wave of attacks, the wave that would have targeted Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, dry docks, and submarine base. His reasoning seemed sound. American defenses were now alerted, his carriers were at risk, and he had achieved tactical surprise. But by leaving those facilities intact, he preserved America's ability to sustain naval operations from Hawaii. The fuel tax alone held 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to power the Pacific Fleet for months. Their destruction would have forced the U.S. Navy back to the West Coast, adding thousands of miles to every operation. Even more critical, the American aircraft carriers weren't in port. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea on various assignments. These carriers, the ships that would decide the Pacific War, survived unscathed. Nagumo had destroyed yesterday's Navy, the battleship force, while tomorrow's Navy, the carrier force, remained operational. But the attack's greatest failure wasn't tactical, it was political. Yamamoto had privately expressed hope that a limited strike might shock America into negotiations. Instead, it unified the American public overnight. The isolationist movement, which had kept the U.S. out of the European war, evaporated instantly. President Roosevelt's speech to Congress the next day, a date which will live in infamy, received unanimous support except for one dissenting vote. America went to war with total commitment, something Yamamoto had feared most. Meanwhile, Japan's southern offensive unfolded with shocking efficiency. Within 6 months, the empire controlled an area stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The Dutch East Indies fell, securing the oil that had sparked the conflict. Singapore, Britain's impregnable fortress, surrendered in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines were overrun, despite Douglas MacArthur's defense. Everywhere, Allied forces were in retreat.
In Tokyo, the victories produced dangerous euphoria. The army leadership declared the war essentially won. Newspapers proclaimed Japan's invincibility. But in the offices of the Navy Ministry, Yamamoto and his staff were watching different numbers: aircraft losses, fuel consumption rates, and most ominously, reports of American industrial mobilization. In the first 6 months of war, Japan completed 2 aircraft carriers. The United States laid down keels for 17. Japan produced roughly 3,500 combat aircraft. American factories delivered over 24,000. The disparity Yamamoto had warned about wasn't theoretical anymore. It was becoming operational reality. And then came Midway. June 4, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the turning point arrived at a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days. When it ended, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with their irreplaceable air groups and experienced pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. In terms of raw numbers, it seemed like a tactical defeat, a single battle lost. But to the men who understood Japan's strategic position, Midway was the beginning of the end. Admiral Nagano, who had warned Emperor Hirohito before the war that victory was impossible, watched the battle reports come in with grim resignation. Japan's carrier construction program couldn't replace the losses. The pilots killed at Midway represented years of training that couldn't be replicated. Most critically, Japan's economy simply couldn't sustain the attrition rate. Every ship sunk, every aircraft lost, every trained pilot killed was a permanent reduction in combat power. America's losses, meanwhile, were temporary inconveniences, quickly replaced by the vast industrial machine Yamamoto had feared. The mathematics Yamamoto had presented in 1941 began manifesting with cruel precision. By late 1942, American shipyards were producing one escort carrier every month, one fleet carrier every 3 months. Japanese yards managed to complete only 6 fleet carriers during the entire war. American aircraft production reached a peak of 9,000 planes per month in 1944. Japan never exceeded 1,000. The resource advantage that Japanese strategists had sought by conquering Southeast Asia was meaningless when they lacked the ships to transport those resources and the industrial capacity to process them. Worse, Japan's merchant marine was being systematically destroyed by American submarines, the very same submarines whose base at Pearl Harbor Nagumo had left intact. In 1941, Japan had approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1945, only 12% remained. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies were torpedoed before they could reach Japan. Cargo ships carrying rubber, tin, and rice went to the bottom of the Pacific by the hundreds. The empire was slowly starving, and its war machine was grinding to a halt. Yamamoto didn't live to see the worst of it. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages detailing his inspection tour of forward bases. P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. He was killed instantly. Some historians suggest Yamamoto may have welcomed this end, dying in battle rather than witnessing the annihilation he had predicted. His death removed one of the few voices in Japan's command who still understood the strategic hopelessness of their position. By 1944, the admirals who had warned against war found themselves managing its catastrophic conclusion. Admiral Yamamoto returned to government as Navy Minister in 1944, began quietly advocating for peace negotiations, the same position that had cost him his office in 1940. But now the institutional forces that had pushed for war resisted ending it. The Army leadership spoke of honorable death and fighting to the last man. Proposals for defending the home islands called for sacrificing millions of civilians in a final apocalyptic battle. The admirals watched their fleet, once the third largest in the world, reduced to scrap. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed nearly every operational warship in a desperate gamble to halt the American reconquest of the Philippines. They lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The super battleship Yamato, named for the soul of Japan itself, was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945. It carried only enough fuel for a single voyage because that was all Japan had left. American aircraft sank it long before it reached the target.
By summer 1945, Japan's cities were burning under incendiary bombing campaigns. The Navy couldn't defend them. It had no fuel, no aircraft, no pilots. The admirals who had calculated the odds in 1941 saw their predictions fulfilled with mathematical precision. But still, the government couldn't surrender. The military code of Bushido, the fear of domestic coup, and the sheer institutional momentum of war made peace politically impossible, even as Japan faced annihilation. On August 6, 1945, the American B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 70,000 people died instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki, 40,000 more dead in a flash of light. The weapons that ended the war were technological terrors that no one had predicted in 1941, but they didn't change the fundamental equation that Japan's admirals had calculated 4 years earlier. They simply accelerated the inevitable conclusion. Even before the atomic bombs, Japan's strategic position was terminal. The Soviet Union had declared war on August 8, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force and destroying the Kwantung Army in days. The last hope that the Soviets might mediate a negotiated peace evaporated. Japan was now facing invasion from two directions, with no navy to defend its coasts, no air force to protect its cities, and an economy that had ceased functioning. On August 9th, the Japanese Supreme War Council met in an underground bunker in Tokyo. The arguments that followed revealed the same divisions that had plagued Japanese leadership throughout the war. Army officers argued for continued resistance. They spoke of bleeding the Americans in a homeland invasion, making the costs so terrible that negotiations would follow. They invoked samurai honor and the sacred duty to protect the emperor. But the admirals, those who had opposed the war from the beginning, finally found their voice. Admiral Yonai, Navy Minister, and one of the few surviving members of the pre-war peace faction, argued for immediate surrender. He was supported by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, another longtime opponent of the war. The meeting deadlocked, 3 votes for surrender, 3 against. At 2 a.m. on August 10th, in an unprecedented move, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki asked Emperor Hirohito to break the tie. The emperor's decision to accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender was delivered in his own voice via radio on August 15, 1945, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor speak. He cited a new and most cruel bomb, but also acknowledged that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was a euphemism for catastrophe. Japan's cities were ashes, its military was destroyed, millions were dead. The empire that had stretched across Asia was gone. In the years that followed, as historians interviewed surviving Japanese military leaders, a consistent narrative emerged. Admiral Yonai told American interrogators, "I always thought that we could not win the war. The question was how to bring it to an end." Admiral Nagano, before his death in 1947, reportedly said, "We knew it was hopeless, but we could not stop what we had started." And Yamamoto's own written correspondence, examined after the war, revealed his private conviction that Japan would lose, a conviction he held even as he planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. These admissions raised a haunting question. How could men who knew their cause was hopeless commit their nation to such destruction? The answer lies in the terrifying gap between military knowledge and political will, between strategic realism and institutional momentum. The admirals understood the mathematics of industrial war, but they could not overcome the cultural, political, and military forces pushing Japan toward conflict. Their warnings were documented, their calculations were accurate, and their predictions came true with devastating precision. But in the machinery of war, being right is not the same as being effective. The war Japan's own admirals said was unwinnable cost the empire everything. By August 1945, Japanese military deaths exceeded 2 million. Civilian casualties reached at least 500,000, with some estimates far higher. The empire lost all its overseas territories, its industrial base was destroyed, its cities were burnt shells. The occupation that followed reshaped Japanese society more fundamentally than any event since the Meiji Restoration. But the true cost wasn't measured only in deaths or ruins. It was measured in the gap between what was known and what was done. The admirals who opposed the war weren't naive pacifists or cowards. They were hard-eyed strategists who studied their enemy and calculated the odds. Yamamoto, Nagano, and Yonai understood American industrial power, logistical capacity, and national will. Their assessments, documented in classified memoranda now preserved in Japanese and American archives, proved accurate in virtually every detail. This raises uncomfortable questions about institutional decision-making in times of crisis. How does a government commit national suicide when its own experts predict disaster? Several factors converged in Japan's case, and they offer lessons that resonate far beyond World War II. First, institutional rivalry prevented unified strategy. The Army and Navy operated as competing power centers, each pursuing objectives that made sense in isolation but were catastrophic in combination. The Army wanted war with the Soviet Union and focused on continental Asia. The Navy feared war with America but was pressured into supporting Southern expansion. Neither service could override the other, so Japan pursued contradictory goals simultaneously, stretching resources beyond sustainability.
Third, cultural factors created political paralysis.
The concept of saving face wasn't just about personal honor, it was embedded in institutional structures. Admitting the war was a mistake would have required the military leadership to accept responsibility for hundreds of thousands of deaths. It would have delegitimized the entire basis of military government. So even as defeat became obvious, surrender remained politically impossible until American weapons made it unavoidable. Fourth, democratic institutions had been systematically dismantled. By 1941, Japan's government was effectively a military dictatorship. Civilian politicians who opposed war were silenced, sidelined, or assassinated. The Diet had no power to check military decisions. This meant that expert analysis, however accurate, could be ignored if it contradicted military institutional interests. The admirals could calculate that war was unwinnable, but they couldn't force the government to act on those calculations. Finally, there was the dangerous illusion of controlled escalation. Japanese leadership believed they could strike, seize resources, fortify, and then negotiate from strength. They saw the war as a limited conflict with achievable objectives. They didn't understand or refuse to accept that attacking America would unleash total war. Yamamoto understood this, which is why his warnings focused on national mobilization and unlimited industrial capacity. But the Army leadership dismissed these concerns as Navy pessimism, assuming American resolve would crack under pressure. The result was one of history's most preventable catastrophes, a war that Japan's own military experts predicted would end in defeat, launched anyway through a combination of institutional failure, cultural rigidity, and political paralysis. Behind the strategic calculations and institutional failures were human beings trapped in impossible circumstances. Consider Admiral Yamamoto's final months. After Midway, he knew the trajectory was irreversible. Staff officers reported that he became increasingly withdrawn, sleeping poorly, chain-smoking cigarettes late into the night while reviewing loss reports. He had staked Japan's survival on a desperate gamble, and he had watched it fail. Yet he continued planning operations, issuing orders, maintaining discipline, because abandoning his post was unthinkable. Or consider the junior officers who flew the missions, commanded the ships, and led the ground forces. Many were educated men, some trained abroad, who understood the odds. Letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal their private thoughts. A fighter pilot named Saburo Sakai, who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times, wrote, "We all knew the American planes were better, more numerous, but we had our orders and our duty." The disconnect between what soldiers knew and what they could say created a culture of fatalism, fighting with honor even in a lost cause. Then there were the families, the civilians who placed their trust in military leadership, the parents who sent their sons to war believing they served a righteous cause, the factory workers who labored 18-hour days building planes and ships for a war effort they were told was succeeding even as their cities burned around them. The atomic bomb survivors who wondered in the decades that followed why their government hadn't surrendered sooner before such weapons became necessary. And perhaps most tragic were the junior officers who launched the kamikaze attacks in the war's final months. These pilots, most barely out of their teens, were sent on one-way missions because Japan had exhausted all other options. They wrote farewell letters to their families, speaking of honor, duty, and sacrifice. But they were sacrificed not to achieve victory. By late 1944, victory was impossible, but because the government couldn't admit defeat. Their deaths served only to delay the inevitable by days or weeks. The admirals who had warned against war bore their own burden. Admiral Yonai survived the war and testified extensively at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. When asked why he hadn't resigned in protest before Pearl Harbor, he answered simply, "Resignation would have changed nothing, and I believed I could do more good by remaining in a position to moderate decisions." It's the rationalization of every insider who stays within a corrupt system, hoping to limit damage from within. We'll never know if he was right. Yamamoto, at least, was spared witnessing the end. His death in 1943 meant he didn't see the kamikaze campaigns, the atomic bombs, or the surrender. There's a Japanese concept, Meiono Sentoshi, death with honor in battle.
By that measure, perhaps his ambush over Bougainville was preferable to what came after. But his real legacy wasn't the tactical brilliance of Pearl Harbor, it was the accuracy of his warnings. He told Japan's leadership the war was unwinnable. He was ignored, and he was proven right at the cost of millions of lives. The story of Japan's admirals warning against unwinnable war isn't just historical curiosity, it's a case study on how institutions fail during existential crises. And its lessons are disturbingly relevant to the modern world. We live in an era where expert analysis is increasingly dismissed when it contradicts political objectives, where institutional rivalry prevents coordinated strategy, where short-term thinking dominates long-term planning, where saving face takes precedence over acknowledging mistakes, where democratic oversight of military decisions is eroding in many nations. The mechanisms that drove Japan towards catastrophe in 1941 exist today in various forms across the globe. Consider the parallels to more recent conflicts. The Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan launched despite warnings from military analysts that it would become an unwinnable quagmire. America's Iraq War initiated over the objections of State Department and intelligence community experts who predicted sectarian chaos. Wars begun with optimistic timelines and confident predictions, which then dragged on for years, consuming blood and treasure far beyond initial calculations. The pattern repeats. Experts warn, leaders ignore. Short-term tactical success breeds overconfidence. Long-term strategic failure unfolds, slowly, then suddenly. By the time the warnings are proven accurate, the institutional momentum of war makes stopping nearly impossible. And the people who pay the price are rarely those who made the decisions. Japan's admirals understood something profound, that in modern industrial warfare, wars are won not in the first battle, but in the sustained mobilization of national resources over years, that surprise attacks can provide tactical advantage, but cannot overcome fundamental disparities in population, production capacity, and economic strength, that hoping your enemy will quit is not a strategy. These truths seem obvious in hindsight, which is all the more remarkable that they were ignored at the time.
The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War introduced a new dimension to this calculus. In the nuclear age, the cost of being wrong about war's winnability isn't just national defeat, it's potentially species-level catastrophe. The stakes are higher, yet the institutional dynamics that drove Japan to disaster, rivalry, face-saving, momentum, dismissal of expert warnings, persist. There's a Japanese phrase used in reference to the Pacific War, mudashini, meaningless death. It refers to soldiers killed in operations everyone knew were futile, ordered anyway because stopping would mean admitting previous deaths were also meaningless. It's the sunk cost fallacy written in blood. And it explains why Japan fought on for months after defeat was certain, because accepting reality would mean accepting that millions had died for nothing. Breaking that cycle requires institutional courage. It requires leaders willing to acknowledge mistakes, halt failed strategies, and accept short-term humiliation to prevent long-term catastrophe. Admiral Yonai tried. Admiral Yamamoto warned, but warnings without power are just words, and words couldn't stop the war they saw coming. In 1956, 11 years after the war's end, a group of Japanese historians interviewed surviving naval officers for an oral history project. The tapes were sealed for decades, only recently made available to researchers. In one interview, a former captain who had served on Yamamoto's staff was asked, "Did the admiral ever believe Japan could win?" After a long pause, the captain answered, "No," and he told us so repeatedly. But we followed him anyway, because that is what officers do. It's a chilling admission, discipline and duty overriding rational analysis. But it also reveals the human dimension of historical tragedy. These weren't monsters or fanatics. They were professionals, bound by codes of loyalty, honor, and obedience to authority. They made rational decisions within an irrational system, which is how most historical catastrophes unfold. Today, the Admiral's warnings are preserved in archives. Yamamoto's correspondence, Nagano's strategic assessments, Yonai's memoranda.
They sit alongside the casualty reports, the surrender documents, and the occupation files. Together, they tell a story about the gap between knowledge and action, between expertise and power, between what is known and what is done. The Pacific War didn't have to happen. The admirals who understood this tried to prevent it. They failed not because their analysis was wrong, but because analysis alone cannot overcome the institutional, cultural, and political forces that drive nations toward conflict. Their tragedy is that they were proven right in the worst possible way. Their legacy is a warning across time that being right about war's consequences doesn't matter unless you have the power to prevent it. The war Japan knew it couldn't win cost millions of lives and ended in atomic fire. It destroyed an empire and reshaped the global order, and it began because warnings were ignored, experts were dismissed, and momentum replaced strategy. The admirals who calculated the odds became passengers on a ship they couldn't steer, sailing toward a destination they predicted with terrible accuracy. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes, and the voices of those admirals warning about unwinnable wars and ignored by those in power echo still. The question we must ask ourselves across all nations in all times is whether we're listening.